There are places on this earth that seem to exist on the very edge of our world, outposts of solitude where the boundary between the known and the unknowable feels perilously, palpably thin. A lighthouse is perhaps the ultimate symbol of this defiance. It is a needle of stone and light, a testament to human engineering and human endurance, standing firm against the raw, untamable, and utterly indifferent power of the sea. Tonight, our story takes us to the turn of the 20th century. The Victorian age is breathing its last, giving way to a new era of scientific confidence and industrial might. But on the wild, windswept fringes of Scotland, the old world, a world of myth and shadow, still holds sway. We must travel 20 miles west of the already remote Outer Hebrides, across a treacherous stretch of ocean that sailors call the Stream of the Blue Men, to a small, isolated cluster of rocky islands. They are known as the Flannan Isles, and upon the largest of these, a barren crag named Uneaten Big Isle, stands a lighthouse. It is here, in the final frigid and storm-lashed days of December 1900, that a chilling discovery was made, one that would become the quintessential Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery, a dark and haunting chapter in Scottish history, and a tale that continues to defy all explanation. To truly understand this story, to feel the cold dread that settled on the men who stumbled into this enigma, you must first understand the island. Uneaten was not a welcoming place. It was never meant for men to linger. For centuries it was known to sailors and the hardy shepherds of the Hebrides as the Other Country. This wasn't just a quaint nickname. It was a statement of fact, a warning. It was a place apart, governed by different, older rules. The island was steeped in superstition, believed to be inhabited by spirits or phantoms, and the restless spirits of its long-dead saints. A small ruined chapel dedicated to the 7th century Irish saint, Saint Flannan, stood on its eastern slope, a site of pilgrimage, but also a source of deep awe and fear. The shepherds who brought their flocks to graze on the island's surprisingly lush grass during the brief summer months would never, under any circumstances, stay the night. They spoke of ancient unwritten rules passed down through generations like sacred texts. One must always turn sunwise die seal when arriving on the island to show respect. One must never kill a bird, for they were the souls of the departed. And one must never, ever speak of the island by its proper name while at sea, for fear of angering whatever ancient consciousness resided there. It was a place that demanded reverence, and it instilled a primal, deep-seated fear in even the most stoic Hebridean heart. The lighthouse, a magnificent 75-foot tower of brilliant white brick, was a new god on this ancient island. Completed just 1 year earlier, in December 1899, it was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a beacon of modernity and reason thrust into the heart of this myth-haunted landscape. Its powerful lamp, fueled by paraffin and magnified by intricate Fresnel lenses, could be seen for over 20 nautical miles, a guiding star for ships navigating the treacherous North Atlantic waters. The lighthouse was manned by a rotation of 4 keepers from the prestigious and highly disciplined Northern Lighthouse Board. 3 men were on duty at all times, living in Spartan but sturdy quarters built into the base of the tower, while a 4th was on shore leave, enjoying a brief respite with his family on the mainland. It was a life of profound, almost monastic isolation, governed by the precise clockwork of routine, the capricious whims of the weather, and the endless lonely cry of the gulls. Our story begins its inexorable slide into darkness on December 15, 1900. The steamer Archtor, on a transatlantic voyage from Philadelphia to Leith, is battling its way through a violent storm as it passes the Flannan Isles. Her captain, a man named Holman, notes something strange and deeply alarming in his log. The lighthouse on Uneaten, the one constant he should be able to rely on, is not lit. In the violent churning darkness of a winter storm, the guiding light is out. This was a serious breach of maritime safety, a potential death sentence for any ship navigating these waters. But due to the ferocity of the storm, Captain Holman was unable to report his observation until he docked in Scotland several days later. By then, the gears of the mystery were already turning unseen on that lonely, storm-battered rock. The official relief vessel, the Lighthouse tender Hesperus, was scheduled to make its routine journey to the island on December 20th. Its mission was to bring fresh supplies, mail, Christmas provisions, and to rotate one of the keepers. Joseph Moore, the fourth man in the rotation, was aboard, returning from his shore leave, ready to take his turn in the lonely vigil. The three men waiting on the islander who should have been waiting were Principal Keeper Thomas Marshall, First Assistant James Duckett, and Second Assistant Donald MacArthur. However, the same brutal weather system that had battered the Archtor kept the Hesperus docked in port at Bruscleat, on the Isle of Lewis. It wasn't until Boxing Day, December 26th, that the seas calmed enough for the ship to finally set sail. The delay, though frustrating, was not unusual for that time of year in the North Atlantic. No one was overly concerned. Yet, aboard the Hesperus was its master, Captain James Harvey, a seasoned and respected mariner, and Joseph Moore, the relief keeper. As they approached Eilean Moor under a cold, gray, and unforgiving sky, a sense of deep unease began to settle over the ship. The island was unervingly, preternaturally silent. The first sign that something was wrong was the flagpole. There was no flag flying from the mast, a standard practice when the keepers were expecting the relief vessel. The second was the landing stages. There was no sign of life, no figures in blue serge uniforms waiting to catch the ropes and guide the tender's boat in. The lighthouse itself stood stark and silent against the sky, a brilliant white tombstone against the gray backdrop of the clouds and sea. Captain Harvey, a man not given to flights of fancy, felt a growing sense of professional dread. He ordered the ship's horn to be sounded and a signal flare to be fired. The loud, mournful blasts echoed off the cliffs, but the only response was the frantic, panic screeching of thousands of seabirds, gannets, fulmars, and gulls startled from their rocky perches. There was no human reply. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. A deep, chilling dread began to creep into Joseph Moore's heart. These men were his colleagues, his friends. He knew their routines, their unwavering discipline. They were servants of the light, men who lived by the clock and the logbook. They would never neglect their duties like this. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. A small boat was lowered into the choppy water, and Joseph Moore, his face a mask of anxiety, was rowed to the eastern landing stage, the one more sheltered from the prevailing wind. As he stepped onto the cold, sea-sprayed rock, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crash of the waves and the mournful cry of the wind through the rocks. He began the long, arduous climb up the steep, winding steps carved into the cliff face, his heart pounding in his chest with every step, each one taking him closer to a truth he was beginning to fear. He reached the lighthouse compound, a small walled enclosure containing the tower and the living quarters. The main gate was closed, as was the door to the living quarters. He cupped his hands to his mouth and called out the names of the three keepers. Thomas, James, Donald. His voice was swallowed by the wind, carried away over the empty sea. There was no answer. With a growing sense of terror, his hand trembling, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that struck him was the cold. The air was still and frigid, the kind of deep, damp cold that settles into a place that has been uninhabited and unheated for days. In the small entrance lobby, he saw two sets of oilskins, heavy, waterproof gear essential for any work outside in the brutal Atlantic weather were gone, but a single coat belonging to Donald MacArthur remained hanging on its peg. This was the first truly strange, illogical detail. Why would two men go out into a storm, and one man remain behind, only to later go out himself without his heavy coat? He proceeded into the main living area, the combined kitchen and sitting room, and it was here that the mystery deepened into a scene of eerie domestic disturbance that would become legendary. A fire lay cold and gray in the hearth. The clock on the wall had stopped. On the kitchen table, a meal of salted meat, pickles, and potatoes sat uneaten, as if the men had been about to sit down to dinner when something urgent and terrible, had called them away. And most famously, a single kitchen chair was overturned, knocked to the floor, a small violent accent in the otherwise oppressive quiet. It was the only sign of haste or panic, the only disruption in the entire lighthouse. Moore continued his search, his footsteps echoing in the tomb-like silence. He went to the sleeping quarters. The beds were made neat and tidy. The lamps throughout the lighthouse were trimmed and filled with oil, ready to be lit for the coming night. Everything was in its proper place, a testament to the disciplined, almost military lives of lighthouse keepers. But the men themselves were gone, vanished, erased from their own small world. Moore, now deeply shaken, retreated from the silent tower, a place that now felt profoundly hostile. He returned to the landing and was rowed back to the deck of the Hesperus. His face was pale, his voice trembling as he reported the impossible scene to Captain Harvey. "The keepers are gone," he said. "The place is empty." Harvey knew he had to investigate further. He sent 2 more sailors ashore with Moore. They conducted a more thorough search of the lighthouse and the surrounding island, looking for any clue, any sign of what had transpired. It was then, in the operational part of the tower, that they found the lighthouse logbook. The logbook is the heart of this mystery. It is our only testament from the lost men, a chronicle of their final days. The entries were logged on a slate during the day and later transcribed neatly into the main log. The last entry was for 9 a.m. on December 15th. For 11 days, there had been no one there to record the weather, the state of the lamps, or the simple routines of life. The entries leading up to that final day were what truly sent a chill down the spines of the search party. They painted a picture not just of a storm, but of a descent into a state of psychological terror. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper, had written of a severe storm, the likes of which he had never seen in his 20 years of service. He wrote that James Ducat had been very quiet, and that Donald MacArthur, the third man, had been crying. This was a shocking, almost unbelievable detail. MacArthur was a big, brawling seaman, a tough man from the Outer Hebrides, not a man known for weeping. For a man of his reputation and fortitude to be reduced to tears suggested a level of fear that was incomprehensible. On December 13th, the log noted the storm was still raging with such ferocity that the men were praying. These were hardened, professional men, accustomed to the fury of the North Atlantic. They had weathered countless storms. For them to be reduced to prayer suggested a psychological element, a terror that went beyond mere wind and water. It suggested they felt they were under assault from something more than nature. On December 14th, there were no entries at all. A day of unnerving silence. And then the final cryptic entry on the morning of December 15th. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. And then nothing. An 11-day silence that has never been broken. Captain Harvey sent a frantic telegram back to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. It read, "A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the occasional have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that." The official investigation began immediately. Robert Muirhead, the board's superintendent, a stern, methodical man who had personally recruited and knew all 3 men, made his own journey to the island. He conducted a meticulous, painstaking inspection, and his findings would form the basis of the official explanation for one of the most famous vanishings in maritime history. But his explanation, while logical, would fail to quiet the storm of speculation and fear that the story would unleash, a storm that rages to this day. To understand the theories that bloomed like dark flowers from this mystery, we must first understand the men whose fates we are debating. There was Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper. He was a man in his 40s, a seasoned veteran of the Lighthouse service, a man with a solid, dependable reputation. He was a widower with children, a man who understood loss and responsibility. He was not a man prone to panic. There was James Duckett, the first assistant. He was also in his 40s, a married man with a wife and 4 children on the mainland. He was known to be experienced and level-headed, a steady hand. He had over 2 decades of experience at sea and in lighthouses. He was looking forward to his relief and seeing his family for the new year. And then there was Donald MacArthur, the second assistant or occasional keeper. He was the wild card. The youngest of the 3 in his late 20s, he was a strong, burly man from the Isle of Lewis, a Gaelic speaker who knew the sea and its moods intimately. He was known to have a fiery temper and was reportedly a brawler who was as quick with his fists as he was with his words. He was not a career lighthouse man, but a seaman filling in for the regular keeper, William Ross, who had fallen ill. It was MacArthur, the tough guy, the islander, who was recorded as weeping during the storm. This detail, more than any other, suggests the presence of an extraordinary stressor. These were the 3 men, trapped together in a stone tower on a god-forsaken rock, surrounded by a raging sea. What could have possibly happened to make them all disappear so completely? The theories can be broken down into several categories: a rational, scientific explanation, a theory of human violence, and a descent into the supernatural. Let's begin with the official theory, the one proposed by Superintendent Muirhead, and the one that remains the most widely accepted explanation today. This is the theory of the rogue wave. Muirhead's investigation focused not on the eerily calm lighthouse itself, but on the west landing of the island. The east landing, where more had come ashore, was relatively sheltered. The west landing, however, faced the full uninterrupted fury of the North Atlantic. And here Muirhead found evidence of almost unbelievable destruction. A supply box containing ropes, chains, and other equipment had been stored in a crevice in the rock over 110 feet above sea level. It had been smashed open, its contents strewn about. Heavy iron railings along the path had been bent and twisted out of shape as if they were made of wire. A section of the railway track used to winch supplies up the cliff had been torn from its concrete moorings, and a massive block of stone weighing over a ton had been dislodged and moved. The power required to inflict such damage is difficult for a modern mind to comprehend. Muirhead, a man who understood the sea, concluded that the island had been hit by a series of monstrous, abnormal waves during the storm that had been battering the coast between December 12th and 14th. He pieced together a plausible, if tragic, sequence of events. The scenario goes like this. On the afternoon of December 15th, after the storm had seemingly passed, 2 of the keepers, likely the senior men, Marshall and Duckett, put on their oilskins and went down to the west landing. Their purpose was to secure the ropes and the supply crane in the storage box, which may have been damaged or loosened in the storm. They would have seen the wrecked supply box and started to assess the damage, perhaps trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Suddenly, and without warning, a massive rogue wave, far larger than the preceding ones, rose up out of the deceptively calm sea. It wasn't just a wave. It was a moving cliff of water. It crashed over the landing with unimaginable force, a wall of white water, sweeping both men from the rocks and into the churning ocean. They would have been killed instantly or drowned within moments, their bodies dragged down into the depths. Back at the lighthouse, the 3rd man, Donald MacArthur, would have been in the kitchen, perhaps preparing the meal they would all share upon the other's return. He would have been waiting. When they didn't return after a reasonable time, he would have grown anxious. Looking out from the tower, he might have seen the colossal wave strike, or simply seen that his companions were gone. In a state of panic and desperation, he did something incredibly rash. He ran out of the lighthouse to try and help them, or to see what had happened. In his haste, he didn't even stop to grab his heavy coat or his oilskins. This would explain why one set of oilskins in his coat were left behind. He ran down the path to the landing, and he too was caught by another monstrous wave and swept to his doom. This theory is neat. It is based on physical evidence. It explains the damage to the West Landing. It explains the disposition of the clothing. It provides a rational, natural explanation for the disappearance of 3 men. The overturned chair in the kitchen could have been knocked over by MacArthur in his final desperate dash from the building. The uneaten meal could simply have been prepared for later, not a meal that was interrupted in the moment. And yet, for all its logic, the rogue wave theory is riddled with nagging questions, small points of friction that have kept the mystery alive for over a century, preventing the case from ever being truly closed in the public mind. First, why would 2 experienced veteran lighthouse keepers, men who knew the sea better than they knew their own children, venture down to a landing so close to the water's edge, 110 feet below the safety of the lighthouse, so soon after a major storm? The Northern Lighthouse Board's own rules strictly forbade leaving the lighthouse during a storm. Even if the storm had passed, they knew the sea would remain treacherous and unpredictable for days. It seems like a profound and uncharacteristic lapse in judgment, a violation of their most basic training and instinct. Second, why was the main door to the lighthouse closed and latched? As Joseph Moore first reported, if MacArthur had run out in a blind panic, it's highly unlikely he would have stopped to carefully close the door behind him. Some later accounts and investigations have disputed this detail, suggesting the door was ajar, but it was a key part of the initial discovery story that captured the public's imagination. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the logbook entries. The descriptions of the storm, the crying, the praying. This suggests a psychological element, a level of fear that goes beyond a normal weather event. Were they praying because of the storm, or because of something they saw in the storm? The log entries feel like a report from a siege, not just a storm. These unanswered questions open the door to darker, more speculative theories. Let's consider the grim possibility of foul play. Could there have been a fight? The presence of Donald MacArthur, the known brawler, makes this an intriguing, if grim, possibility. Imagine the 3 men, trapped together by the storm for days on end, the isolation, the constant roar of the sea, and the claustrophobia of their stone prison gnawing at them. Tensions rise. An argument breaks out over a card game, a perceived slight, anything. MacArthur, with his fiery temper, snaps. A fight ensues. He kills Marshall and Duckett. Horrified by what he has done, he carries their bodies down to the sea and throws them from the cliffs. Then, consumed by guilt and madness, he leaps into the waves himself, a final desperate act of atonement. It's a dramatic, cinematic theory, but it is supported by zero physical evidence. The lighthouse was neat and orderly. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains, no broken furniture apart from the single overturned chair. It is a theory based entirely on one man's reputation, a character assassination from beyond the grave. What about foul play from an external source? Could the men have been abducted? By foreign spies, perhaps? Some have suggested a German U-boat, even though this was well before the First World War. Or perhaps pirates or smugglers, who silenced the keepers because they had witnessed some illegal activity taking place in the coves around the island. This theory is even weaker. Why would anyone go to such a remote, inhospitable island? What could possibly be the motive? And how could they have subdued 3 strong men without leaving any trace of a struggle? It stretches credulity to its breaking point. This is where the story of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse mystery veers into the strange territory that has so captivated the public imagination. This is where we must consider the supernatural and the psychological, the elements that the official report could never address. Let's return to the island itself. Eilean Mor. The other country. The island was said to be haunted by the phantoms of the seven hunters, and the spirit of its patron saint was said to demand reverence and would punish those who transgressed. Could the intense, oppressive atmosphere of the island, amplified by the fury of the storm and the profound isolation, have simply broken the men's minds? The logbook entries about MacArthur crying and the men praying take on a new, more sinister light in this context. Were they praying because of the storm, or because of something they saw in the storm? Did they see a ghost? A sea serpent? A vision? Did the island's folklore, its inherent otherness, finally get to them, driving them mad? In a fit of collective psychosis, a folie à trois, did they simply walk out of the lighthouse and into the sea, embracing a watery grave to escape the horrors they perceived? This leads to a more modern pseudoscientific theory, the influence of sound. The island is riddled with caves and narrow inlets, known as geos. During a powerful storm, the wind and waves crashing into these geos could create a powerful, low-frequency sound or infrasound, below the range of normal human hearing. Scientific studies have suggested that exposure to infrasound can cause feelings of unease, dread, sorrow, and even auditory and visual hallucinations. Could the men have been driven mad not by ghosts, but by the relentless, maddening sound of the island itself? Could the crying have been a physiological reaction to a sound they couldn't consciously hear? A sound that made them believe they were in the presence of something terrifying, forcing them to flee their post for the relative quiet of the outdoors, a fatal mistake? And then there is the most fantastical theory of all, the one that whispers of a monster from the deep, a giant sea serpent or some other unknown creature, rising from the waves during the storm and plucking the men from the rocks. It's a thrilling Pulp Fiction image, but it belongs to the world of legend, not investigation. Yet, in a place like Eilean Mor, a place the locals called the other country, the line between legend and reality can sometimes seem to blur. The legacy of the Flannan Isles is not just the disappearance itself, but the stories it has spawned. The tale has been immortalized in poems, songs, films, video games, and even an opera. The most famous is Wilfred Wilson Gibson's 1912 poem, Flannan Isle. It is Gibson who gives us the most memorable, and almost entirely fictional details that have become embedded in the popular version of the myth. He writes of the three men staring at the overturned chair, as though they just sat down to supper. He imagines their inner thoughts, their growing dread, their final silent departure. He pens the famous lines, "We seemed to stand for an endless while, / though the signature was still to dry, / and the birds were still on the building sill, / and the stone was still warm from the sun." His poem, while a masterpiece of atmosphere, has forever blurred the lines between the facts of the case and the fiction of the legend. So where does that leave us? We are adrift in a sea of speculation, with no land in sight. We have a plausible yet flawed official explanation. We have grim theories about murder and madness. And we have a host of supernatural theories rooted in the island's dark folklore. The truth is, we will never know for certain what happened to Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. Their bodies were never recovered. The sea never gave up its dead. The island kept its secrets. The most likely explanation remains the rogue wave theory. It is the only one supported by any physical evidence, the extensive damage to the West Landing. The inconsistencies can perhaps be explained away. The men were professionals, but even professionals can make fatal mistakes. Perhaps their concern for the expensive equipment of the lighthouse board overrode their personal caution in a moment of poor judgment. The closed door may have been blown shut by the wind after the last man left. The logbook entries could simply be the writings of a man, Thomas Marshall, who was more poetic and pious than his colleagues, describing a truly terrifying but entirely natural storm in the only language he knew. But the mystery endures because it is so perfectly formed. It is a locked room mystery on a grand elemental scale. The isolated setting, the sudden total disappearance, The eerie crime scene with the uneaten meal and the overturned chair. The cryptic final log entry. These elements combine to create a story that is more powerful than the sum of its parts. It is a perfect ghost story, a true life tale of the uncanny. It speaks to our deepest fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of nature's overwhelming power, and the fear of simply ceasing to be, of being erased from the world without a trace, leaving behind only a few baffling clues. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands to this day, now automated, its powerful light sweeping out over the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic. It is a silent monument to the three men who served it, and to the enduring, unsolvable mystery they left behind. They were guardians of the light who were ultimately consumed by the darkness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most haunting vanishings in modern history. The fate of the Flannan Isles keepers is a puzzle with missing pieces that will likely never be found. What do you believe happened on that lonely rock in December 1900? Was it a freak of nature, a human tragedy, or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you appreciate these explorations of history's great unsolved cases, please consider subscribing to our channel. There are many more mysteries waiting for us in the shadows of the past. Until next time, sleep well.